Well, hello there, minders. Welcome back to another Mind of Watercolor. And today I decided, as a follow-up to my episode on painting this, where I used the gouache, I got a lot of great comments from you out there asking questions about that, asking about other alternatives, and I thought that would make a great episode. So what we are going to do today is talk about all the alternatives there are out there for including white in your painting, okay? And there are a bunch. I do have my preferences, and I think there are pluses and minuses to all of them, and this is not exhaustive by any means, but this covers, I think, all the main categories, and so you should have a good idea of what you can use and what will work best for you, or a direction that you can head. This will also show you if you have something in your arsenal already. It may suffice. It may be something you say, oh, I don't have to go out and buy an acrylic or a gouache. I've got this already, so I can use this. So we're going to look at all these and just help you figure out what will work best for your technique and for your situation. And if you want to buy something, it'll help you make an informed decision. Okay, we're going to begin with the water soluble, or I'll call it rewettable, because they're all water-based. So these would be non-permanent. And to start off with is probably my favorite, and that's just white gouache. I'm just going to get my palette over here. Gouache is very versatile. You can actually mix it to the exact color that you need, or you can put it down white. You can glaze over it, you know, if it's not too intricate. And I'll show you how that works. Since it is rewettable, you have to be careful of glazing. These two brands are two of the best, I think. This is M. Graham Zinc White. This is Winsor Newton Permanent White. I don't really have an opinion over what kind of white, whether it's zinc or titanium. One of the reasons I like gouache is I just like knowing that I'm still using a watercolor. I think that's probably number one. It is considered by many to be a watercolor. And, you know, I'm working in watercolor, so my white is watercolor. I like that. So let's just put a little bit out here on my gray palette. Gray palettes are great for mixing gouache and opaque paints, because you can see your color on a neutral gray, but you can also see how opaque it is. That's something that's not necessarily with watercolor, but it's a good thing to see when you're dealing with opaque whites. Gouache is highly opaque if you get a good brand, and a lot of times when people are using white, they like to put it out fresh from the tube. It takes a while to re-wet and get it that thick. If it's already dried, you can do it, but it's just a little quicker if you want to go right to a very opaque color. This is somewhat diluted. I put it down really heavy. Several of you brought up John Singer Sargent uses gouache, and indeed he did. Usually in his watercolors you'd see just like a little brush stroke or something of it here and there. Now gouache will work in pens. This is a dip pen. I've got a Browse nib in here. I think this is a 361. This is a Browse 361. This is nicknamed the Blue Pumpkin. For things like paint and gouache and acrylics and whatnot, I like these bigger nibs with the bigger capacities, and they also kind of spread further. I think that just works better for handling viscous paint. But yes, you can put it through a nib. Now it requires more thinning, so it's not going to be quite as opaque. You just thin it out till you have like a milk consistency, and you just load it. Oh, look what I did. I don't think this nib is completely broken in. It's not holding the liquid very well. Try it. So you can take and draw with it. If you prefer doing fine, intricate lines that way. By the way, that little mistake there, that's something that's done a lot with watercolorists. They'll spatter it, maybe even mix it to a color and then spatter it. You get a nice wide spreading nib like this, and again, this is not broken in because it's beating up, but I think you can see that you can get great detail and fairly intricate detail that way. I just have, this is just paper, just blue paper, so it's not watercolor paper, but you know, it could be mixed with washes and give yourself kind of this watercolory cloud. I've seen people use gouache to color to like yellows and stuff to simulate glows around things, or to paint streaks of light over something. You can do that by lifting too, but it's done sometimes with gouache. Anyway, white gouache. All right, in a similar category, I've got two here that we're going to look at. These are both water-soluble, rewettable, but they're both different. These are both intended for different purposes, but they work like gouache. So first, let's look at Dr. Martens Pin White. Now this Pin White, it kind of represents a whole category out there of water-soluble inks, correction fluids for graphic artists, that kind of a thing. So I don't have all of those, but things like Pro Art, or there's a Dr. Martens Bleed Proof White, which I think is just a thicker version. I'm going to go ahead and write that down. This is already of a good consistency for thinning out and putting through a pen or an airbrush. That was kind of why it was designed. It's very white. You can see it's, I don't know if that shows up on video, but you can see it's whiter even than the M-gram zinc white. So out of the bottle, it's more liquid, highly opaque. You can mix watercolor into it. Don't mix it into your watercolor. But you can tint it with watercolor. It acts pretty much just like gouache. And when it's all dry, it will re-wet. If I can get my nib here to hold this. Does very well in a pen, which is what it was designed for. Some very fine lines. So, Dr. Martens Pin White. And as I said, you'll find others out there on the market that are going to advertise being the same way. Highly opaque, water-soluble, rewettable white paint, essentially, like gouache. Alright, so let's look at this one. This is called Aqua Cover. This is a Creative Mark product by Jerry's Artorama. It's designed as a correction fluid for watercolor paper. What makes it unique is that it's slightly off-white. It's like a eggshell white. It's designed to go on natural white paper, and you can even buy different versions. They have arches and they have Fabriano. Now, I've not found it to exactly imitate the arches natural white, but it is kind of a unique product in that it's not pure white. You know, a lot of times white can be a very kind of a bleached, unnatural, bright white, and you have to keep this stuff stirred. And this comes pretty thick. I had to stir it and even add a little water to it. I don't know if it's just been on the shelf too long or what, but you can do that. You can thin it, and you can correct large areas with this on watercolor. Generally, it's just exactly like gouache. It's a nice warm white, and it is very, very opaque. You can see here I've even thinned it down a little bit. It's designed not to crack. I'll mention about the Dr. Martens Pin White. I did have trouble. If I put it on really, 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 really thick, it will crack. So it's not a good idea with this. However, this Aqua Cover is designed to go on thick and still not crack. Gouache, it will depend on the brand. I've not ever found any problem with the M-gram gouache cracking, but you never know. I've not really put it to all of those tests. So let me get it nice and fluid here. We're going to put it in our pen. See how the Aqua Cover works. Flows very well. Very nice. Very, very nice. I think, though, I'm finally getting this nib broken in, so it's probably flowing off my nib a little better. Aqua cover. And as usual, I'll have a list of all of this down below. It's from Creative Mark, which is a Jerry's Artarama brand, as I said. So that's pretty much represents what I have in the water-soluble rewettable category. Great alternatives. All right, now let's talk about color. In most cases, unless it's a really hot highlight or it is actually a white object, you're going to want to color these highlights. In a lot of cases, the white is just way too stark. So your options are you can mix the color that you want to begin with, and that's fine. I've done that. Another thing I like to do is glaze. Just glaze right over the whole thing, because I can bring the value up as bright as I want it, maybe brighter than I want it, and then I can tone it back down. Now, glazing works best with permanent mediums, but it can be done with these rewettable ones if you're careful not to overbrush it. It takes a light touch. Well, let me show you. So what I'm using here is Schmincke watercolor, and I'm getting it fairly bright because it's going to tone down a bit once I put it on the paper. And I'm making sure that my brush is fairly dry. I don't want to put a lot of water. So this is the Dr. Martens Pin White. You can see I glazed right over that without loosening any of it up. Again, keeping a fairly dry brush. Here's the gouache. And you would know if I were loosening up the gouache, because it would make little cloudy halos around there where I could do it. If I start brushing vigorously, you can see what happens. There goes your glaze. It got messed up. So it's getting fairly concentrated pigment in your brush, making sure it's dry, and you can glaze over even the lightest lines if your brush is not too wet. Now I streaked it a little bit there. Honestly, if I were drawing lines that thin, I would probably just mix the color, because it's hard to go back and glaze over hundreds of little fine lines. But it's glazing works pretty well with gouache when you have a bigger solid area like this. If you wanted to put in a tree, for instance, that you didn't mask out, you could go back then and glaze. You just have to be careful. Aqua cover, it works too. The easiest way to glaze over fine lines is just to glaze right through the back, as long as you have a background where it doesn't matter. In the case of this, I used similar color as was back here, so I was able to just glaze right over everything, and it didn't matter a whole lot. And I'm very, very lightly touching these with this color. So though you have to be careful, you can glaze over these rewettable, water-soluble whites. Alright, so let's look at permanent. Alright, the first category, and I'm just going to use these two to represent a very, very, very large category, and that's white acrylic. I have this Winsor Newton Titanium White Finity Artist Acrylic. That's a real high quality acrylic. One I use a lot and prefer is this Acrylic gouache. It's really acrylic. Don't let the gouache name fool you. You'll remember on this piece that I made a correction here where the tree overlapped the roof, if you saw this episode. And doing that, I used acrylic gouache. And basically I used thin glazed layers and built up till I had it opaque as I want. I didn't go full white, but pretty white. And then I glazed the watercolor over it. This Acrylic gouache has a nice matte tooth to it, so it works for smaller corrections like that. I've also successfully used this. I'm going to put a little of each of these out. It's the Winsor Newton acrylic. This is the acrylic gouache. It's a little more fluid already. And as I said, this represents a large category. You have any number of acrylic brands from Golden to Liquitex. You have different viscosities. There are a number of liquid acrylics out there. You just have to be careful about the surface it leaves. If you're just doing white, then it doesn't matter. If you're going to glaze color over that, it needs to be able to be receptive to that medium. These have nice opacity. I don't think acrylics are quite as opaque as gouache, but it's okay. I mean, if you're trying to put it down and build it up, you can use it that way, and sometimes it's a good way to do that. And I always use separate brushes from my watercolors. I don't use the same brushes. Get it to thin to a right consistency, it will go through a pen, especially this Browse 361. And you can, if you have some acrylics, it's just fine to use. You don't have to go out and buy the regular kind of gouache if you don't want to, especially if you're feeling like you may only make these corrections occasionally. So a good, slightly more translucent, but a good option is acrylic. And if you have acrylic, try what you have, but just be careful of the tooth and building up too many layers, or it kind of has a plasticky film, and it will affect the watercolor if that goes down on top of it. Now, speaking of tooth, here's a really good option. This is Watercolor Ground. This happens to be the Core brand. I like this because the Core brand is very fine. It's very finely ground. But Watercolor Ground is just a type of a gesso with an absorbent ground for watercolor. So it makes a really good medium for glazing over or painting on top of. You can actually prime canvases with this stuff and turn it into a watercolor painting medium or surface. But you can treat it like paint too. And you just, I'm just going to put out a little bit out here and seal my jar back up. I think the biggest strength of this is large corrections. If you want to make a really large correction or put in a really big like tree trunk, you can do that. It's got a slightly sandy texture. It does thin out, very translucent, but you can build it up. But again, the advantage is you will have a nice surface to paint on. So in that kind of a situation, I'm not going to put that through the pen. I don't know if Watercolor Ground is the kind of thing you would put through a dip pen. I don't think I would. You might even want to be careful if it's a palette you want to keep clean, to clean that off right after, because ground is like a gesso and you'll end up priming your palette. You could use a paper plate or something if you want to put that down. So good alternative, really the best alternative for making really large corrections or blocking in a really large item that you wanted to have in there but didn't. The Watercolor Ground, as I mentioned, just gives you the best base to paint on. Now the next category is another broad category. I actually have 4 examples, and that's inks. It's white inks. I've got this J. Herbin calligraphy ink, Dr. Martens Bombay white India ink, and FW, which is a pretty well-known line of acrylic inks. And one more. This White Ink 30 by Kuretake. And I'm going to leave that for last. This was probably my favorite, but the consistency of this is more like paint. It's really thick, and it needs to be thinned out. The rest of these come in an ink-like consistency. And I'm just going to briefly show you them. I think these are the least opaque of all. Now you can apply these with a brush. They're mainly formulated for pens. So if you're going to do a lot of opaque work with a pen, these are already sort of in that vein, in that consistency. But as you can see here, you can put them down with a brush. That's the J. Herbin, that's the FW. Alright, let's look at the next one. And I want to just go ahead and write that. It's J. Herbin. J. Herbin is a very fine maker of quality pen inks. It really is not very opaque. And when I got it, it had settled quite a lot. I think the FW seemed a little more opaque. It was a little thicker too. I think of all the options for using white in your watercolor painting, the inks are my least favorite. However, if that's what you have, maybe you have some calligraphy ink sitting around or some FW. I used to put FW through my airbrush a lot back in the day. It's a fine alternative. I mean, it's just fine. If you're going to go out and buy something specifically for white, I'm not necessarily recommending inks. Let's just look at Dr. Martens Bombay, and unlike their Pin White, it's permanent because it's an India ink. India ink, at least the black India ink, supposedly uses a sort of a shellac. I'm assuming it's true since they're calling this an India ink. I'm assuming it's true of the white also. Pretty good opacity. About the same consistency as the FW. It's a little thicker than the J. Herbin. All of the inks flow off the pen, but I'm getting the most opacity performance out of the FW and the Dr. Martens Bombay. Again, not my first choice for putting white in watercolor, but a usable option if that's what you have. And I'm not going to worry about showing you glazing over those. It's going to be pretty much like glazing over acrylics. They're permanent and they won't re-wet, so you have that advantage. This is my favorite. This is Kuretake Whiting 30. And it really is more like a paint. It comes... I've had to thin this several times because it really comes pretty thick. Right now it's about the consistency of heavy cream, very heavy cream, but that's only because I thinned it out. Before that it was like kind of soupy pudding. It's very permanent. It's highly opaque. So let's take a look at that. Now I'm going to recommend that you go to JetPen's site. They have some really great guides. I've mentioned them before. They have reviewed a lot of white inks, and it's just a really great site, all the guides that they have. But their white ink guide is excellent. This is the one ink out of this group. This is the one ink that I would recommend if you want to go an acrylic or permanent route with watercolor. I mean, you can just see the opacity is incredible. It's really coming back to the gouache level of opacity. Alright, so thinned it a little bit. Really nice. Works well in a pen. And on the JetPen site, this was one of the recommended inks for graphics. Alright, so here we're going to talk about what I have in my hand, and that is the unique and very useful gel pen. And I'm only going to talk about this one. This is my favorite. This is the Jelly Roll. Now obviously a pen only gets you line. You can color in with it. Now there are several white gel pens out there on the market. Most of them I don't like for watercolor. The Uniball Signo is a really good one. However, it's not permanent. It's water soluble, so it needs to go in that category. But I just like this better. I have less skipping with this. It's just very responsive. It's reasonably opaque. And once it's dry, it's permanent like acrylic, and I can glaze right over it. So if you need something, and I love taking these in the field. These are great for plein air and just doing, you know, some quick little highlights and things, especially where you just need a line. All right, and last but not least, let's look at the lowly colored pencil. And it does have its uses. Now we can talk about all different kinds of pencils and brands, and I know there's talk about how the quality of Prismacolor has gone down. I think their white is still probably one of the most opaque whites. You get some, it's not super opaque, and of course you can see grain when you put it down heavy, but you can just get some really nice subtle drawing effects that you can't get with anything else. And sometimes you just want to put down a really nice faint line. A color pencil is a way to do it. Let me just show you how I would use it, for instance. Now, for instance, if I zoom way in on this, you see where I've been doing these grasses. And I actually did a lot of that in white gouache or colored gouache. But you could also do it with a colored pencil. And you can get some nice, very subtle, like very faint grasses. Now it's stark white, and watercolor will not glaze over this at all. It usually acts like a wax resist because it is wax. So really all you need to do is just go to a color. So back to my example, I would probably be more likely to use something like this beige, or perhaps this warm gray, French gray, just so the colors blend with the surrounding area. So don't forget the colored pencil. It may just solve a particular problem or effect that you're trying to get. And you know, with acrylic and especially with colored pencil and ink, we're kind of entering the mixed media zone, which is fine. You know, results are what count. Alright, so lots of options, and there's one I actually forgot to mention, and that's what I wrote these headlines with, and that's this Pitt artist pen. It's a bit too fat to do any detail, but if you needed to white out an area, it is an indie ink based marker and considered an artist pen. So it's very opaque, and that's another option. Alright, I hope if you have any questions, you'll just put them down in the comments and I'll try to answer them. Hope this gives you some ideas. Might help you decide if you want to use white or not. Might help you decide which ones to use, what's going to work best for what you paint, and might even open up some possibilities with some supplies you already have on hand. So thanks everyone for watching. We will see you in the next video. Bye bye.